Ms. Carey. Thank you. May I call, please, Mr. Sullivan, who can be sworn?
Please stand and repeat after me.
Okay.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please take a seat.
Sullivan, thank you so much for coming to help. I appreciate that it's not going to be easy for you, but we're really grateful to you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, just start, please, with your full name.
It's John James Sullivan.
Right. And I'm going to ask you some questions, please, about your family and in particular your daughter Susan.
Yeah.
And I think you have made a statement to help us. And if you need to look at it, it should be in the bundle in front of you.
Yeah.
All right. Susan, I think, was born on the 17th of November 1963.
Correct.
And she was born with Down syndrome.
Yes.
And she died, as we're about to hear, on the 28th of March 2020.
Correct.
And she was 56 at the time.
Correct.
Just help us, please. Just summarise a little bit about Susan, who I think you called Susie. Is that right?
Susie, yeah.
Susie. Just tell us a little bit about Susie and some of the things that she did during her life.
Yeah, well, Susie was born, as you say, with Down syndrome. We were told she wouldn't walk, she wouldn't talk. And every time we took her to a doctor, there was something positive, there was a negative. So I came home one day and my wife was crying. She'd been to the GP. I said, right, forget the doctors. We're going to do this our way. And we crawled round the floor with her. We smacked her bum if necessary, or tapped her bum. We encouraged her to crawl, we encouraged her to walk, and then she just blossomed. Her talking wasn't good, but then she became the dancing queen. I mean, she swam in the Special Olympics, she won gold, she won silver, she won bronze. She was just a remarkable, lively, empathetic person. She was just a special human being. I mean,
And I think you said that, did she live at home with you and your wife, Ida?
all the time, yeah.
But
All
she
her life.
attended some day centres during the week.
That's right, yeah. She went to day centres 5 days a week.
She was on holiday with you.
Always on holiday, yeah, yeah.
And between you and your wife and I think Susie's brother, Clifford, you looked after her.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. And her brother Andrew before he went off to Australia, to live in Australia.
In terms of her health, is this right, that in 2018 she was fitted with a pacemaker,
Yeah.
but other than that, no major problems?
No, no. She was as fit as a fiddle. I mean, you don't win gold, silver and bronze medals swimming if you're not fit.
No. Can I come to the start of the pandemic? And I think, is this right, that around the beginning of March, you and your wife and Susie started isolating to try and keep COVID away from her. Is that right?
Yeah. We couldn't understand why the government basically didn't appear to be doing anything. They didn't appear to be doing anything. You know, the no borders shut down. There was no, you know, they were doing nothing. I mean, even the Prime Minister was telling people to shake other people's hands. I mean, it was a kind of a lunacy. We were in this worry. And we decided, well, we closed down. And what we did then is everything that came in the house, we were confined to the house in the back garden, and our son Clifford took control. Right. And everything that came in was sprayed with disinfectant cans. We did everything humanly possible to protect ourselves and Susan from. Our neighbours did all the shopping, and Clifford did all the shopping, you know what I mean?
But in spite of those efforts, is this right, that Susie began showing COVID symptoms around the 21st of March?
That's
of
right.
2020?
Susie suffered with Graves' disease, and she had a habit of rubbing her eyes. and we think that's possibly where she picked it up before we'd locked down, and it taken hold afterwards.
And I think you said in your statement that having had a few days of you trying to look after her at home, she began to perk up at around the morning of the 26th of March.
I mean, I was with Susie. We did puzzles. We did. I mean, because I'm riddled with cancer anyway, and my idea was like, you know, I'm going to die anyway, so what the hell, you know what I mean? And I'm going to look after her and be with her. So we planted bulbs in pots in the back garden. We did puzzles. We watched her favourite movies, Grease, about 400 times, and we did all these kind of things. But she was kind of up and down, if you understand. She was a bit lethargic at times, but other times she was great. She was fine. She was quite normal.
I think, though, notwithstanding the ups and downs, by the morning of the 27th of March, she began to complain of a tummy ache. Is that right?
Yeah.
And was it then in the early hours of the 27th of March that I think you asked your son to call an ambulance?
Yeah, we did.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you remember what time that was, Mr. Sullivan?
Well, I'd been up with Susie the night before by her bed, and then they woke me about 4 o'clock.
In the morning?
Said, in the morning, 4 a.m, and said, Susie's complaining about tummy ache. And I went into the bedroom, into Susan's bedroom, and my wife then was in a bit of a flat because she just read a story on her iPad about a lady dying with COVID, and they said that was a
symptom.
A symptom of COVID. And so therefore, I left it for about 45, 50 minutes, and I said to Clifford, because she was in really, really, really bad pain with her tummy, I said, I think we better phone an ambulance. And we phoned an ambulance about 4:45, 4:50, something like that.
Now, we know from Susie's records that she went into the hospital about midday. So from ringing the ambulance just before 5 a.m. and the ambulance turning up is a good few hours. Is that right, Mr. Sullivan?
Oh, yeah. I mean, not only that, I mean, the ambulance was diverted.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. So in that time, when you rang the ambulance and Susie ending up being taken to hospital, how many times did you or the family try to get the ambulance out to see her quicker?
Well, Clifford was on the phone. I think he spoke to him 3 times. I mean, when they hadn't come the first time, then they told us that they'd had to divert the ambulance. And of course, you know, when these things happen, you know, and in retrospect, you start to think, was it diverted because she was Down syndrome? You start thinking these things, like, you know what I mean? Because she was poorly, she was obviously poorly, and why did they divert her ambulance? It never made sense.
Can you remember now roughly what time the ambulance did eventually arrive?
Well, Ida had phoned the pharmacist, the local pharmacist, to get some advice about the belly pain, and he said, don't wait any longer for the ambulance. He said, just get her in a car and get her to the hospital. So we got her out of bed, got her dressed, and we just got her down the stairs into the kitchen. I was putting her shoes on, and the ambulance arrived. So it was probably something around about 6 hours, 6 hours after,
So
6.5 hours maybe.
Yeah. So in that time, 3 calls from the family to chase up the ambulance and a call from Ida to the pharmacist to try and seek some advice.
Yeah.
And then eventually, just as you're getting ready to leave, the ambulance arrived.
The ambulance arrived, yeah.
And can you remember now whether the ambulance crew were wearing any protective equipment, masks, goggles and the like?
The only thing I can remember, I'm pretty sure, because I was in a bit of a state at the time, let's be honest. I'm pretty sure I remember them having masks on and gloves. but I don't think they had anything else on. I mean, to be honest with you, they were in the house 2 minutes because Susan was sitting in the chair. They came in, I think they took her temperature or put something on her finger, I can't remember, and they stuck an oxygen mask on her, which surprised me because she'd never complained about any breathing issues. They stuck the oxygen mask on her and she was gone. So it was that quick.
And is this right? Was it your wife that went in the ambulance with Susie?
Yeah, my wife went in the ambulance with her, yeah.
And I think then you can tell us about what you understand happened to Susie once she got to A&E.
Yeah.
And obviously Ida's helped tell you about what happened there. In the emergency department, do you know now, was Ida allowed to go in and be with Susan while she was being assessed and decisions were being made about how to
No, not
treat her?
initially. Not initially. She was sent into a room to wait. And so therefore any discussion regarding Susan's health or well-being was the conversation only took place with the medics and Susan. And, you know, if you have a conversation with Susan about ABBA, Cliff Richards, Meatloaf, you know what I mean, Grease, you're in with a chance. You start talking to her about a medical, well, you know, she wouldn't have had a clue. So, you know, I never understood. Over 50 years, we've sat in a hospital or a doctor, and the doctors realised within seconds that Susan needs, you know, isn't able to discuss. So therefore...
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
So in the past, when Susan's needed treatment or help with something, has it been you and Ida that sort of helped understand, helped Susan understand what was going on?
Always.
And help the doctor understand
Yeah.
what Susan needs?
My wife used to keep a literally detailed record of everything. Like, you know. And they would ask us, not exclude Susie, bring her into the conversation, but anything of any importance, the answer to the question would come from either Ida or myself.
So you help really the communication between the professional and Susan? And
Absolutely, yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
All right. So Susan initially was on her own with the doctors.
Absolutely.
But did there come a point when Ida was allowed to go in and be with Susan?
Yeah, they made a reasonable adjustment and allowed Susan into the Ida in to see Susan, but it was only for a short period. Ida said she loved Susie. Susie said, "I love you," and basically that was it. But there was no conversation about Susan's health. How has she been? How long has she had the tummy ache and so on and so forth. So there was no discussion of that nature.
Now, I think you said in your statement that there was a discussion between Ida and the doctor once Ida had left Susan. And can I ask you about that, please? Can you tell us now what it was the doctor asked Ida?
Yeah, the doctor, and this was in quite early stages, the doctor asked Ida if she had anything in place for DNR. And
do you mean do not resuscitate?
Yeah, okay. And Ida didn't quite grasp what he was saying. And Ida challenged the doctor, said, "Would you explain that for me?" You know, he said, he explained what he meant, and she said, "No. Susan's never been seriously ill. You know what I mean? We have no reason to have a plan of that nature. So therefore, in the event it becomes necessary, we would want to resuscitate it."
Yeah. If I've understood you correctly, if a doctor had tried to speak to Susan about a do not resuscitate order, do you think Susan would have been able to grasp what the doctor was saying to her?
She wouldn't have had a Scooby. She would have had no idea what they were talking about. I mean, Susie would say upstairs when she meant downstairs and downstairs when she meant up. So, you know what I mean?
So
Asking her a question of that nature, she wouldn't have had a clue.
It really needed you and Ida or Clifford to be there to help.
Well, it needed that for 50-odd years. This was the first time in 50-odd years they deemed it unnecessary.
And I think after that discussion, it wasn't long after that Ida left the hospital and came back home. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And can I just ask you this? Is it right that when Ida went to the hospital with Susan, Ida wore her own PPE?
Correct, yeah.
What did Ida take with her to wear?
Ida took she wore a mask and she wore gloves.
Do you know what the plan was for once Ida had left, you to be updated about how Susan's condition was?
No, it was all kind of up in the air, and they basically said to call the ward later, call the ward later. I mean, the thing about it is that the A&E guy had called Ida to the door before she left. Called Ida to the door before she left and said, "Oh, we're very happy with Susan," and blah blah blah, and called the ward later. Basically, I mean, how the hell they were happy with Susan is another question. I don't know.
But the impression that Ida was given was that Susan was stable, it was okay, and
Yeah.
Ida, you can go home.
I mean, the reality is the doctor, Susan had one chance of life. That was ITU. End of. That one chance. And at the end of the day, this doctor knew that he was sending her into a ward, into a bed to die in. End of. So for him to turn around and say, "We're very happy with Susan," was pretty cruel. It was pretty cruel.
Pause there, Mr. Sullivan, because I want to show you a document that might help explain the answer that you've just given. And can you turn, please, behind tab 2 in your bundle? And could we call up, please, INQ 483292?
Yeah.
And page 2, please. All right, this is some of... Can you see that all right, Mr.
Yes,
Sullivan?
thanks.
Pull your chair in by all means. I want to just look at some of the things on this document. This is Susan's medical records, and the top part of the page deals with the position as Susan came in to the hospital.
Yeah.
You can see she's 56, she had a fever. It records there that she has Down syndrome. She had a pacemaker in situ, but no other cardiac comorbidities.
No.
Independently mobile, despite being non-verbal. And if you just go down the page, can you see where it says plan?
Yeah.
And number 6.
Yeah.
At that stage there, this was the plan for Susan's care at the beginning.
That's what we were told.
Yeah, was that she would be reviewed for ITU if her condition was not improving.
Exactly.
Right, so that's sometime around midday-ish
Yeah.
on the 27th.
Yeah.
All right. Now, can we go down the page again, please, to the addendum at 1536? Pause there, thank you. And could you highlight that, please? This is added to the notes a little bit later that afternoon, and it says ITU declined in view of Down syndrome and cardiac comorbidities. And then it sets out various statistics and saturation levels and says she can move to the ward.
Yeah. At the end of the day, that is what started. That one line in that medical note is what started my quest for the truth. Because I'm not a medical person, but I brought Susan up with my wife and my family. Down syndrome shouldn't be a reason for decline in ITU. And a pacemaker, which is the comorbidity they're talking about, and which was subsequently proved in the investigation. But that is what triggered I couldn't believe that she could be declined ITU because she was Down syndrome.
Yeah. Now, that brings me exactly on to what the review found some years later. So let's look at that now. Can we call up, please? And it's behind your tab 4, INQ 483295, and page 8, please. My lady, in due course, we'll hear that there was a review conducted by the hospital, but I would like to deal with this now. Can we look, please, at the top 2 or 3 paragraphs? Because it picks up on what Mr. Sullivan has just been saying, and the review there at 3:36 that afternoon, recording that Susan had been declined ITU admission due to cardiac comorbidities and Down syndrome. And when this was investigated by the hospital, they said this: the investigating team have been unable to find any documented evidence of an ITU review taking place and can conclude that the patient was not reviewed face-to-face by ITU staff. A contemporaneous record of conversations held between the admitting ITU consultants on the 27th and any reasons for declining ITU admission does not show that the patient was discussed for consensus opinion on ITU suitability, as was the recognised process at the time. This led the review team to conclude that either the patient was not discussed at consultant level or the discussion was not recorded. So it appears she was not seen by ITU staff, and the lack of records mean either there was a failure to record a consultation or in fact there was no discussion at all. But Mr. Sullivan, looking at the next paragraph, the reviewing team considered the degree to which the patient's cardiac comorbidities would be a reason for not admitting Susan to ITU and agreed that the presence of moderate to severe mitral and aortic regurgitation and a cardiac pacemaker would not be exclusion factors for ITU on their own, but could certainly adversely affect patient outcomes. So the pacemaker was not a reason for her not to go to ITU. Is that right, Mr. Sullivan?
Yeah.
All right. And equally, reference to Down syndrome as a reason for not admitting to ITU was also reviewed and again agreed this was not a reason for declining Susan ITU admission. So the 2 reasons at 1536 for saying she shouldn't go into ITU, the review said were not proper reasons for not allowing her into the ITU.
That's it. That's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, you know, the thing about it is that the reasons they gave her to decline her, let's be honest, declining her ITU was declining her a chance of life. And to put down bogus reasons, I mean, you know, even a non-medic like me looked at it, jumped off the page and said, this can't be right. So, you know, somebody's put that down. And the question is the person that wrote that on a medical notes the only person in the last 4 years of this battle I've had with the hospital is the only person that's ever told the truth in the whole thing, because it's been decline, cover up, obfuscate. But I've asked 1,000 times if Down syndrome and a pacemaker were not the justifications for decline in ITU, why is it on a medical note? And nobody wants to tell me.
Well, can I just finish dealing with that page? Because the review went on to set out what was going on in that hospital's intensive care unit that day. And you can see there that on the 27th of March, they had 27 level 3 patients. The baseline capacity was 23 beds, so they were already had more patients than they normally would have. And it goes on to say that they were expanding a neighbouring ward, albeit it's not clear if they were expanding it on that day. And even within a few days, that also had reached its maximum surge capacity. All right. So Susan was not admitted to ITU. And is this then to pick up the story of what happened to her? was Clifford the one liaising with the hospital to find out how she was doing?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because a mother was in a diabolical state. I was in a diabolical state, trying to look after her, trying to deal with the reality of what had happened, and the only one that was keeping a level head was Clifford.
So Clifford's,
so it was
Clifford's
sensible,
liaising.
yeah, he was doing the liaising, yeah.
And then the next morning, on the 28th, was the family told that Susan wasn't tolerating her oxygen mask and kept taking it off?
Yeah, a nurse phoned, really lovely nurse, and she phoned and she was pleading with us to plead with Susan to keep her mask on, because she said she's benefiting from which is backed up by the medical notes, benefiting from keeping the oxygen mask on. And then Clifford tried talking to Susie first, and then I just spoke to Susie, and by the time she was so distressed. I didn't get a chance to speak to her again. And the vexing thing is that had that reasonable adjustment that was made in the A&E and when she was dying, had that been made in that 20-year period in family by the bedside, to help her keep her oxygen mask on that they said she was benefiting from,
Yeah.
the outcome could have been different.
So that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, Mr. Sullivan. Once Susan went onto the ward, were any of the family allowed to go and visit her to
No.
comfort her, encourage her to keep her mask on?
No.
No. All right. Do you think, knowing Susan, that if you had been, or one of you had been allowed at the bedside, that would have helped Susan understand what was going on?
Oh, absolutely. She would have kept the mask on. I mean, she would have kept the mask on, but you got to understand, she was frightened. She's frightened. Everybody in the place is running around with masks on their face. She's being forced to put a mask on her face, and she hated anything on her face. And if we'd have been there just to comfort her, give her that little bit of support, because that's all Susie ever needed, was that little bit of support, the outcome could have been very different. I mean, it doesn't make sense that reasonable adjustment was made in the casualty. Reasonable adjustment was made for Clifford minutes before she died, and yet in that 20-hour period where reasonable adjustment could have been a huge benefit, and it was just denied. It just denied.
Well, let me ask you about that, because if we go, please, to page 10 of the document that may still be on the screen, there is reference in the review to whether sufficient reasonable adjustments were made in light of Susan's learning disabilities. And can you see there in the middle of the page, Mr. Sullivan, reference to the patient was not referred to the acute liaison nurse, it's the second paragraph,
Yeah.
for learning disability. Resultantly, there is no evidence to suggest that the Trust's learning disability team were involved in the patient's care, despite the service being available throughout the pandemic. This may in part have been due to the relatively short time that Susan was in the hospital. It was less than 28 hours, and the service is not available at the weekends. But while Susan was in the hospital, obviously family weren't allowed in.
Yeah.
Do you know if any liaison learning disability team went to speak to Susan,
No.
tried to help with the communication,
Nobody.
anything like that?
Nobody. She was left to her own devices.
Do you think speaking to someone from the learning disability team would have helped Susan?
Oh, absolutely. You know what I mean? And at the end of the day, the thing is, when you're dealing with somebody with learning difficulties, it's either it's something you learn over years, or you have an inborn empathy for, and I'm sure they would have made a difference.
I think you've already mentioned that just before Susan died, Clifford was allowed to go and be with her.
Yeah.
And he was with her when she passed away at about...
She died in his arms.
The cause of death on her death certificate was COVID-19, is that right?
Yeah.
And Down syndrome.
Yeah.
And I think in due course, although there was a delay to the funeral, is it right that hundreds of people turned up or were online?
Yeah, well, yeah, we delayed the funeral. We couldn't even go to a cremation because my illness, my cancer had taken over, and I was having serious treatment, and I couldn't go, and my wife was in no state, and we couldn't even go to a cremation. But then once the time changed and our son was, and my grandson was allowed to come from Australia, we had a memorial for her. And over 240 people turned up at the memorial, and then there were people watching it in Canada, in America, in Spain, I mean, everywhere. Susan didn't matter to maybe them doctors, but she mattered to all those hundreds of people that took the day off to attend her memorial. You know what I mean? So it was. She was just one of life's special people. Like, you know what I mean? She really was. I mean,
a couple of final things from me. I think in due course, we can take that page down, please. You made a complaint in due course to the hospital, and we've just been looking at some of the review documents.
Yeah.
But was that prompted by an article you did for The Guardian?
Yeah, what happened is, for personal reasons, I didn't trust the hospital's complaints department. That's why I've got a syringe driver bag on me now, keeping me alive. So I didn't trust that system, but I needed people with disabled families, disabled loved ones to know that, we're not getting a good deal here. We're not getting a good deal here. And Bereaved Families for Justice put me on to Shanti Das at The Guardian, and I thought, that's great, because that gets the message across.
Pause there then, and we'll just look briefly at the article. It's behind your tab 3, and can I put on screen? Thank you very much. This is a copy of the article. You can see you there, and is that Ida?
That's Ida, yeah.
And there's a photo of Susan.
Yeah.
And I think this essentially was you setting out Susan's story as you have done today. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you putting in the public domain what was written on Susan's records.
Yeah.
And you trying to seek answers on her behalf.
Yeah.
And then did the hospital start the investigation?
Yeah, just out the blue, I got a letter. Somebody must have read it. And I got a letter advising me that they were going to undertake a serious incident investigation. Which they did.
Thank you. And we can take that down because we've been looking at some of the investigation documents as you've been giving evidence. Can I ask you this, please, Mr. Sullivan? Obviously, there are concerns about what happened to Susan, but can I just ask you generally about your views about the NHS?
I'm here because of the NHS. I have great time for the NHS, for the doctors and for the nurses. I'm not going to say I've got great time for the management, you know what I mean? But I have for the doctors and nurses. They're fabulous people, they're fantastic people. And I'm not here to knock any doctor or any nurse. They do a brilliant job, and I've got nothing but pride for them. I mean, they looked after my wife, who's really been seriously ill as well.
And
I don't want anybody to think that I'm here to knock the doctors and the nurses. But if they want me to think I'm here to knock the management, then
all right. Understood.
Go for it.
All right. It's probably obvious to all of us, but can you sum up to us the impact of losing Susan in the way that you did on you and Ida and Clifford and her other brother?
The impact on me on my wife was devastating. It's first of all, me, within a month, Susie passed on the 28th of October, and on May the 9th, I was in the Royal Free Hospital having nuclear medicine treatment that lasted 10 months. So the impact on my health was massive.
Yeah.
I mean, I've, breast cancer 28 years ago, and with all the upset and all the shock and everything, some people say that shock can bring something back, and it came back, and she's had to have a double mastectomy, and you know what I mean. So we've gone through hell and back, and the thing about it is, you die. A part of you dies when your child dies, and dealing with the death of a child is one thing, but dealing with the death of a child because nobody gave her a chance of life is is the hardest thing to deal with. You know what I mean? If she'd have just died of COVID, then we've got to say, well, that's the luck of the draw. But I said in that Guardian article, before the serious investigation, but I knew Susie. I nurtured her, I loved her, I spent all my time with her. And I knew that she just needed a little bit of moral support. But I said in that Guardian article, they gave her a bed to die in. And when I read all of this, serious incident investigation and the treatment at the casualty, when it didn't want to talk to mum, didn't want to talk to dad, all of a sudden we're talking about DNA before we're talking about 1 minute they're going to consider, you know what I mean? When I read all that, it just sadly makes me write what they did. They gave her a bed to die in, and they gave her a bed to die in because she had Down syndrome. End of.
And I think you concluded your statement by saying this: providing this statement to the COVID inquiry has allowed me to give Susan and her disabled peers a voice. That has been my motivation.
I don't want any parent that have invested their whole life in protecting and raising a child with Down syndrome from an infant to an adult. I don't want them to go through what we've gone through. They've got to learn that people with a disability has got as much value as anybody else in this life. And to just cast them away as though they're of no importance and that is wrong. And when the next pandemic comes, I just hope to God, me sitting here just for this, and me struggling with the NHS line machine for the last 3 years, that's had a massive impact on my health. I just hope that when the next pandemic comes along, disabled people are treated with a bit more respect and a little bit more consideration. And that's why I'm here. I wouldn't be here otherwise. And the most important thing, for the first time today, in official capacity, disabled people are being given a voice, which they've been denied.
My lady, that is all I wanted to ask.
Sullivan, I've got no questions for you, just a couple of comments. You're right, Susie does matter, and disabled people matter, and you've done a huge amount to ensure that people understand that.
Thank you.
She was obviously a very special person, and you at least had 56 years with her.
Yeah.
And all I can say is that it sounds as if you had 56 years because of the love and devotion that you and your family showed her.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for what you've done to get people to understand that disabled people matter, and Susie mattered.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well. I shall break now and return in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.